Hello everyone, in this video we're going to talk about all the different methods to solving a quadratic equation. So we have videos that we've done on all of these different methods separately, but I thought why not do one video where we talk about all these different methods and see what each one looks like all together. So we're going to look at 5 different methods today to solving a quadratic equation: factoring, graphing, using square roots, completing the square, and the quadratic formula. So let's get into each one. The first one we're going to do is factoring. So for factoring, it really doesn't matter what our trinomial looks like or what our quadratic looks like, but there are easier ways. There are easier quadratics that we could have that's going to help us to use factoring. Number one, if a is 1, right? So we don't have a coefficient there on the x squared term, so you know it's going to be pretty easy to factor it. We just need to find two numbers that add to b, so add to 8, and also they multiply to 12. Now, sometimes these are not factorable, so factoring doesn't always work, but if it does, it's very quick, it's very easy, and it's always a good method to use. So in this case, we're going to say x plus 6 times x plus 2 equals 0, because 6 plus 2 is 8, 6 times 2 is 12. So now we can set both of these equal to 0. So we get x equals -6 for one of our solutions, and x equals -2 for the other. And that's how we solve by factoring. All right, so now the next method is graphing. So for graphing, it's definitely the most visual of these methods, but it's probably going to take a while to do, and I wouldn't recommend it unless the question specifically says solve by graphing. But it has its place, and it can be used to solve, so let's do it. So remember, the first thing we want to do is find the axis of symmetry, which is x equals opposite of b over 2a. So we're going to say x equals -2 times 2 times 1, which is going to give us -1. So now we can place a vertical line, dashed, I'll make it a dashed line, at x equals -1, and this is our axis of symmetry. So now let's take a -1, and let's plug it in for x to figure out what our y coordinate of the vertex would be. So this would be 1 minus 2 plus 5. So 1 minus 2 is -1 plus 5, and we get 4. So that means our vertex is at -1, 1, 2, 3, 4. And the c value of our quadratic in standard form is our y-intercept. So we can plot that at 0, 5, and we can reflect that point over, and now we have our parabola. So now once we have this parabola, wherever the parabola crosses the x-axis is the solution. So in this case, we're going to say there are no real solutions because the graph does not cross the x-axis. All right, our next method is square roots. So for this one, we do what it sounds like. We take the square root. It looks very simple. This is a great, easy method to use, but we just can't always use it. We have to have certain equations where we are able to take the square root. So in this case, I can take the square root of both sides, and this is going to give me x plus 5 equals positive or negative square root of 121. So anytime we introduce the square root, remember we have to use positive and negative there. So now hopefully you recognize that the square root of 121 is a perfect square, and that is 11. And now we can write our two equations here to find our two zeros. So we have x plus 5 equals 11, and we have x plus 5 equals -11. So let's subtract 5 on both of these, and we get x is equal to 6 for one of our solutions, and x is equal to -16 for our other solution. And for the next method, we're going to use completing the square. So remember, for completing the square, we want x squared and bx on one side of the equation and our constant on the other side. So I'm going to go ahead and start by adding 7 to both sides. So now we have x squared minus 4x equals +7. And now we're going to complete the square on the left side by doing b divided by 2 and squaring that value. So x squared minus 4x, b divided by 2 would be -2. -2 squared would be +4. So now we add 4 to both sides. And now we can simplify by factoring the left side as the square of a binomial. So x minus b divided by 2, so that was -2, squared equals, and now this is 11. Now we can take the square root of both sides, and we get x minus 2 is equal to positive or negative square root of 11. Now, square root of 11 is not a perfect square, so we can just leave it like that. We could simplify by typing that in our calculator and rounding to a decimal, but for now we'll just leave it as a radical. So now we're going to add 2 to both sides. So we can say our solutions are x equals 2 plus or minus the square root of 11. And we'll just leave that for right now. And our last method is the quadratic formula. So the quadratic formula, we can go ahead and write it. X is equal to opposite of b plus or minus the square root b squared minus 4ac all divided by 2a. And now we just plug in our values. So a is 10, b is 7, and c is negative 11. So x equals opposite of 7 plus or minus square root 7 squared minus 4 times 10 times negative 12, all divided by 2 times 10. And so now we get negative 7 plus or minus square root, and this is going to be 49, and this will be plus because we have a negative, 2 negatives in there. And let's do 12 times 4 would be 48, and we can add in that times 10. And now we're going to divide this by 20. And so now we can come over here and say x is equal to negative 7 plus or minus the square root. And this is going to give us 480, 529 over 20. Okay, so now we can check to see if that's a perfect square. Let's do square root of 529. So second square root, 529, and we get 23, so it is a perfect square. So we're going to say x is equal to negative 7 plus or minus 23 divided by 20. And now we can say, let's do one over here. X is equal to negative 7 plus 23 over 20. And we could say x is equal to negative 7 minus 23 over 20. So now we can solve these two to find our two solutions. So x is equal to negative 7 plus 23 would be 16 over 20, which would simplify to 4/5. And over here we'd have x equals negative 30 over 20, which would simplify to negative 3 over 2. And that is how we use the quadratic formula. And so those are all the methods that we could possibly use to solve a quadratic equation.